All right, let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a really fascinating puzzle today, one that's right at the heart of science education. And that puzzle is, how in the world do you measure something as big and important as scientific thinking?
So let's kick things off with this big question. You hear it all the time, right? We want our students to think like scientists. But what does that actually mean? I mean, it's a great goal for education for sure, but what does it look like in the real world, in a classroom?
Well, for one thing, it's definitely not about just memorizing a bunch of facts, right? Like the periodic table or the parts of a cell. The real skill, what's at the very core of thinking like a scientist, is this super active process. It's all about building models, in your head or even physically, to try and understand how the world works. And then you test those models against what you observe. And this is the key part. You change them, you refine them when they don't quite line up with reality. It's this constant loop of creating and then critiquing.
Okay, and that right there brings us to the real sticky wicket. If this whole modeling thing is so important, if it's kind of the gold standard, then how do we know if students are actually learning it? How does a teacher look at a student's project and say, yep, they're getting it. They're on the path to thinking more scientifically? That's the assessment puzzle.
So, in the academic world, there's a specific term for this. They call it modeling competence. And you might think, okay, that sounds straightforward, but it's actually a little more complex. It's really a combo of two different things. There's the doing part of science, and then there's the thinking about the doing.
Let's break that down. Think of it like two main pillars holding this whole idea up. On one side, you've got modeling practices. This is all the hands-on stuff, the actual building, using, and revising of models. But then, and this is just as crucial, you have the second pillar, meta-knowledge. This is the thinking behind it all. Does a student actually get why they're building a model in the first place? Do they understand that a model is just a simplified version of reality, not a perfect copy? That's a huge piece of it.
All right, so to get a handle on how this modeling competence is even being measured, a team of researchers basically decided to investigate the investigators. It's pretty cool. They didn't go into classrooms and study students. No, they studied the studies. They did this huge review of pretty much all the research ever published on this topic.
And when they first started, they cast a really wide net. I mean, they pulled in a massive number of studies, something like 803 citations, that, at first glance, seemed to be on the right track.
But then, they started getting really strict with their criteria. The studies had to be based on actual data, they had to clearly explain how they were assessing students, and they had to be laser-focused on this specific idea of modeling competence. And once they applied that filter, that huge number, well, it just plummeted, all the way down to just 23 studies. 23! I mean, that fact alone tells you a ton about how little really focused research there's been on this specific problem.
So, the big question is, what did they find inside that tiny elite group of 23 studies? Well, they found a huge variety of stuff. Turns out, researchers are using all kinds of different tools and methods to try and get a read on this skill. And I mean a huge variety. We're talking everything from sitting down with students for one-on-one interviews to your classic questionnaires, both open-ended and multiple choice. They saw studies where students had to construct their own models, either just drawing them out or building them on a computer. Some researchers were even using concept maps or analyzing videos of students working and talking through problems together. But here's where it gets interesting. As they started sorting through all these different methods, a strange and kind of worrying pattern started to show up. You see, it wasn't like researchers were using this whole diverse toolkit to get a full 360-degree picture of a student. No. Instead, it looked like specific tools were only being used to measure very specific, isolated little pieces of modeling competence. So you ended up with this really fragmented picture. For example, if you wanted to know what students thought about models, their understanding, you'd use an interview or a questionnaire. If you wanted to judge the final thing they made, their model, you'd look at their drawing or their computer simulation. But these tools were almost never used together to look at the whole student. And you know what was almost never assessed? The actual process of building the model, the hands-on part. It was like everyone was measuring just one piece of the puzzle, and nobody was trying to put it all together to see the whole picture.
And this brings us right to the main conclusion from the researchers themselves. The reason for all this fragmentation, what they identified as the root cause, was the lack of a unifying framework. Basically what that means is the entire field doesn't have a shared, agreed-upon way of even talking about, let alone measuring, this skill. Everyone's doing their own thing.
Here's a good way to think about it. Imagine you're judging an Olympic gymnastics event. But every single judge has their own secret private scoring system. So one judge is only looking at the landing. Another judge only cares about the difficulty of the flips. And maybe a third is just scoring their artistic expression. What would you get? A total mess, right? You'd have all these scores that you couldn't compare, and you'd have no real clue who the best gymnast actually was. Well, that's pretty much the situation we have right now with assessing scientific modeling.
So you might be asking, why is this common framework such a big deal? Well, let's look at the two scenarios. Without a framework, you get exactly what we've been talking about. A bit of chaos. Teachers have no way to compare if one teaching method is better than another. Students are getting all sorts of mixed signals about what's important. And the whole research field just spins its wheels because nobody can build on anyone else's work. But with a common framework, suddenly everything could start to click. Students would have clear goals, teachers could figure out what actually works and develop better strategies, and the whole field of science education could finally start moving forward, together, because everyone's speaking the same language.
And I really want to stress, this is not just some abstract academic debate for people in ivory towers. This stuff has real-world consequences. It directly affects what happens in classrooms every single day. Because at the end of the day, the way we measure learning completely shapes how we teach. If our tests and assessments are all over the place and incomplete, you can bet our teaching will be too. We'll probably just end up focusing on the stuff that's easy to grade instead of the skills that are actually most important for students to learn.
So, all of this leaves us with one last really critical question. It's kind of the big takeaway here. If the experts themselves can't even agree on a consistent way to measure this core skill of scientific thinking, then how can any of us, teachers, parents, even students, be sure that we're actually teaching it effectively? It really seems like the very first model we all need to build is a model for how to measure this stuff in the first place. Thanks for tuning in.